Today's topic is Lando Norris. It's been a bit of a struggle for him this season, although he's still not that far behind in the championship, so it would be a mistake to write him off. But Scott, you've recently been doing some in-depth analysis on Norris's season. I think you've come up with 4 key areas where he's losing out. So should we run through each one of them individually and have a bit of a discussion about them? So what's your first one?
Yes. So the first thing that noticed was obviously we're all very familiar now with the idea that it comes to Q3 and Lando doesn't consistently deliver to the level that he needs to. You'll often see it referenced on social media as him throwing it away or choking or whatever it is. He has been capable of putting in some great Q3 performances, but by and large, that kind of that failure to deliver at the key moment has been there. So I really wanted to kind of establish what that really meant, because we could all kind of observe it, but I was curious to actually look at what the underlying trend was. So when I looked through, I went through every timed session of the season. So FP1s, FP2s, FP3s, each individual qualifying segment, but also sprint qualifying as well. So SQ1, 2, and 3 there. And I remember I shared the numbers with you afterwards because I was really quite startled by just how stark the qualifying drop-off is by Q3s. So that's kind of the first area, this excessive drop-off, where Norris is not just occasionally, Norris is consistently quicker than Piastri in a Q1 or Q2 segment, or SQ1 and SQ2. And this isn't an adjusted lap time, which we might reference sometimes on the podcast or on the website, but just purely based on those gaps in those sessions, has a margin of about just under 1/10 of a second over Piastri across Q1s and Q2s. More often than not, Norris is faster than Piastri in the first 2 segments of qualifying. And then it swings drastically in Piastri's favour in the Q3s. And I believe it's only 4 occasions so far this season across the 12 third segments we've had in main qualifying and sprint qualifying when Norris has been faster than Piastri. So only 1/3 of the time compared to 2/3 or 3/4 of the time faster in Q1 and Q2. And that cannot just be explained by Piastri suddenly getting it together at the last minute, because it's not just suddenly Piastri's ahead. That margin then swings to about 1/10.5 in Piastri's favour, which is obviously best explained by Norris having those Q3 sessions where he really fluffs a lap and ends up several tenths off the pace, versus a few where he's faster or neck and neck. So I think that's the first area to drill into.
Now, Mark, what's interesting here is that there's some specific challenges with this car that we'll talk about in a moment, but this is a trait we have seen hints of with Norris in the past, isn't it? Which is why it feels like it could be just something in the way he drives. Andrea Stella's often talked about the need to kind of be at 99% rather than chasing perfection. So do you think there's enough evidence to say this is kind of a Norris characteristic, not just a year-specific situation for him?
I think there's a few things going on behind those statistics, and one of the several is probably applicable through all his seasons, and that is his preferred way of combining braking and cornering, which does leave you more vulnerable to when you're pushing for the last 1/10 of a second, last 1/2 a 1/10 of a second. It can make you more vulnerable to mistakes in the more straightforward style. But I also think that with this car specifically, it's something that's being exaggerated, because he can drive it at 99% quite comfortably, which is what you'll typically see them both doing in Q1 and Q2. But when you go for the last little bit, there is something about this car that trips Norris up, and he's talked about it quite openly, and it's what the revised suspension that was introduced in Montreal was designed to help him with. We haven't really seen enough of a sample yet to know if that's worked for him, but that's also what's going on. And on top of that, yes, I think in this season in particular, he's definitely feeling the pressure, or not dealing with the pressure as well as Piastri, the pressure of a championship fight. Which is an internal fight within the team. So it brings its own unique sort of pressure. And I do think he is feeling that. Yeah. So there's several things going on there, I think.
Yeah, and that question of the feeling the pressure was something that we did ask questions about last year as well when he was trying to chase down Verstappen. So hasn't been quite the step he's needed there. But Scott, some of the things that Mark alluded to there in terms of the car is, I think, connected to your second point. So perhaps we should delve into that now.
Yeah, I do wonder if the nature of Norris's mistakes can be explained by that pressure, that situation of not just a championship battle, but the fact that, and this is another factor we will get into later, the step that Piastri's made and how quick he is, that I wonder sometimes if Norris is either maybe sometimes reaching for something that's not quite there, because like, for example, Canada was one of 3 weekends this season, and this is another alarming element, where he's been quicker than Piastri in every single session. Practice, all 3 practice sessions, then the 2 segments of qualifying, and then all of a sudden in Q3 it goes awry, and he's got him at arm's length. So it's, what is he? One, is he chasing something that's not quite there in the car? But 2, I'm wondering if it's less about that car element, which we'll come to in a bit more detail in a second, and just a bit, just something not clicking with him. Whether it is him feeling the pressure, whether it is a little bit of that, absolute rock solid elite mentality thing, because there's just been 1 or 2 mistakes this season that aren't explained by that kind of feel from the car, and it's more just imprecision. It's him turning in too late, taking too much speed in, braking too late, and Andrea Stella said in Canada, didn't he, that this was simply Norris just asking too much of the car. And we heard that radio message, didn't we, during the Canada weekend, where his race engineer is telling him, just remember your marks, focus on your braking, don't miss your braking points. And these feel like more fundamental errors, just little ones where, yeah, maybe it is the fact that in Q3, when you are searching for those final fractions of a percent, those final fractions of a second, that Norris himself is getting it wrong. And it's, it's an individual error rather than something attached to the car. But we'll come to that next, I think.
Yeah, I think when you get into a qualifying situation, there are certain places on the track where maybe you can reach for a bit more pace. But I think where Norris sometimes struggles is an area where Piastri's very good. And I don't mean this as a negative, but Piastri seems better capable of accepting if there's, say, a corner where he knows he's going to lose a little bit to Norris because he's not quite there. But he knows better when he can reach for something more there, and when he just has to say, okay, that's where I am at this point, I'll take that, and he's not overreaching and sort of kind of striving for that perfection that sometimes Norris is. And I think that's actually a great strength, judging that in qualifying.
I do think one thing just to add very quickly there is I do think it's interesting. Do you remember what Norris said at the back end of last year, and that thing that Helmut Marko latched onto and was a bit unfair about Norris when Lando talked about how nervous he gets around qualifying? He says he still really feels it. And I do think that's the case for a lot of drivers. It's just a lot of drivers wouldn't be that honest about it. And I think it's definitely laudable that Lando talks about this kind of thing. I think it is something that can be encouraged. But just purely from the sporting competitiveness side, not a human side or mental side or anything like that, it's how you channel those nerves and handle them. And I think sometimes that drives Lando to incredible qualifying performances through the years, through his F1 career, absolutely fierce speed over one lap and incredible judgment when it counts. But I think maybe sometimes it does take a little bit of a hold on him. And obviously he will be feeling pressure and nerves. If that's how he has been through his F1 career, he'll be feeling that on a level that he hasn't felt before.
Yeah, it's that old thing when we talk about the mentality. The key thing in any kind of elite sport is just doing what you do when the pressure is most intense, like it doesn't matter, because then you can just focus on the job in hand. But that element can sometimes be distracting and lead to misjudgment. So that's something that he'll continue to work on. But we've mentioned the car characteristics a few times. It's kind of indirectly. So I think that's your second key point with Norris, Scott.
Yes, so Mark briefly touched on it before, and I think summarised it quite nicely. It's something that's been in this McLaren from the start of the season. I think it's part of the changes that were made to the car to unleash a little bit more pace. The 25 McLaren is basically everything Norris could have asked for in terms of its performance and its performance relative to the opposition. It's what every driver would dream to have. When everything lines up, you've just got that extra little bit of speed in your car if you can tap into it. But it's the tapping into it that's been the issue. And Stella's talked about it. Both drivers have talked about it. There is something in this McLaren that just means there's a little bit of numbness on that front axle. That means that the drivers aren't getting the cueing that they need from the front end of the car to really kind of understand where the grip is and where the feel is, and they're almost kind of preempting it lap to lap based on what it did on the previous corner or the previous lap, rather than feeling how it is in the moment. And there's almost like, I describe it as maybe like a slight delay in feedback, which maybe means, and this is what Mark was getting at in his answer in the first part, the way that Lando tends to drive, I think, is more vulnerable to that, because I think he's loading up the front axle, and I think by extension the rear axle, a little bit more than the way that Piastri wants to drive. And that is something that I think has been there from the start. There is this interesting thing about the change to the front suspension, which is been described more as a setup item rather than, a massive physical part change or anything like that. But that's a very interesting second area. This weakness, let's call it, in the McLaren, or vulnerability in the McLaren, that Norris does seem more susceptible to.
And Mark, this is connected to something we talked about at length in our recent driving style secrets series that we did for the Race Members Club. So check out the Race Members Club if you want to be able to hear that. But it is that slightly more complex Norris driving style versus the slightly simpler Piastri one. And again, I don't mean complex good, simple bad by any means. In fact, generally, the simpler you can do things and get the lap time, generally the better it is in many ways. But that is a clear area where the interaction of the car and drivers is making some kind of difference.
Yeah, the more that you're trying to overlap the braking and the cornering forces, in theory, the closer you are to exploiting the full grip that the tire has to give over a lap. So if you do it perfectly, it should be faster than the more straightforward brake turn in style. But you do really require a good level of feedback from steering and brakes in particular to be able to judge that, so that you're not losing time and so that you're not making mistakes on entry. And this is what I think he's been feeling with this car, that he doesn't have to the extent that he needs to reliably drive in that way and reliably maximize what the tire has to give in that overlapping phase. Whereas it's not something that Oscar tends to do. He tends to have a much more straightforward driving style. So more feedback's always welcome, but he would be less vulnerable, be less exposed to the lack of that feedback than Lando would with the way he drives.
Should we move on to item 3 now on your list, Scott?
Yeah, so this obviously manifested itself in a particularly extreme way in Canada when Lando, there is no better way to put it, drove into the back of Piastri quite carelessly with a move that was very, very, very slightly on, but a gap that was never materializing. It's the question mark over the racecraft, which has been there before. So this isn't something that has just suddenly emerged from nowhere in 25. I think since Lando and McLaren got to the front consistently in Formula One, so back half of 23 onwards, but especially 24, when he was going up against Max Verstappen, it's this question mark of whether or not Lando's quite up to scratch wheel to wheel versus Verstappen. And now, obviously, as we've seen, we saw flashes of Piastri last year, didn't we, with that killer instinct and that ability to grab opportunities that maybe there was a suggestion that Lando couldn't. There was this obsession for a while, wasn't there, about his poor conversion rate of poles into not just wins, but leading at the end of the first lap or after the first corner. And actually a bit of a narrative around Norris goes all the way back to Sochi 2021 and the misunderstanding around that, about why he slid off the road when he did, why he didn't stay out, how that win was thrown away and who was actually responsible for it, because it's never really been, I think, certainly in internet circles, never really been fully understood that it was McLaren misreading things rather than Norris being ignorant or anything like that. So this has kind of dogged Lando for several years. It's just this year it's manifesting itself. Now it's manifesting itself more, and I'm not drawing this comparison lightly, and I think it is happening differently. But it's reminding me, because he's not just like putting it off the road pointlessly and shunting or anything like that. But it's reminding me a little bit of Sebastian Vettel in 2018, where there's just like this run of like micro to medium errors every sort of 4 races or so. That's kind of how it's going. And the question marks with Lando are a bit more kind of just in those moments. What's his judgment like? Will he make the right decision? Is he fast enough getting through? Is he effective enough getting through? And sometimes it'll be a minor misstep like Singapore last year, where he has a near miss while leading comfortably. You remember in Australia this year, he put himself under pressure for the last lap and a bit to Verstappen with that running slightly wide, admittedly damp off line, but Verstappen didn't do that while chasing him. So that was a small mistake he got away with. He went off and lost a few places in China in the sprint. He was slightly questionable at times with his racecraft in Bahrain. And then again in Miami against Verstappen, and obviously rear-ending Piastri in Canada. That's not an exhaustive list of the mistakes or where you can offer a little bit of scrutiny, but I think that is something that is costing Norris results as well this season, especially in combination with a qualifying weakness that is often leaving himself with a bit of work to do on Sundays, and I don't think he's always the most efficient at doing that work.
Yeah, and you'd have to say, Mark, this is, again, one of those trends that's perhaps been there in the past, as Scott alluded to, and it's when you're only looking at a 22-point championship deficit, and it's, you know, that could turn around in one weekend just like that. So he's still very much in it, but you can see how all these things just are adding up to what could have been a championship lead into a deficit.
Yeah, these traits that we're looking at here, these patterns are all contributing to his difficulties for sure, and they will remain something that he will have to be very aware of. But I wouldn't yet say that they were defining. I wouldn't yet say that they are going to prevent him from launching a championship bid or even emerging as the champion. I don't think we're at that stage yet, but these limitations or these like little, I don't know, they're not even, I wouldn't even go as far to call them traits really, little sort of hiccups. They are responsible for where he's at the moment. I wouldn't go any further than that.
Yeah, there is still time, although kind of you start to think when your drivers in their 7th season, are they going to be persistent traits that he's always going to have to do battle with? But it is still not quite set in stone. So there is plenty of chance to still turn it around. Scott, what's your final item on the list?
Yeah, so it's come up a couple of times already, and I did mention it before in isolation. And I think it's the step that Piastri's made. Because one, I think that feeds into other areas that we're seeing from Norris, because if Piastri's faster, Norris has less margin for error. Norris is under more pressure. Piastri's in a championship fight and leading the championship and in a strong position. That exerts more pressure on Lando because he is aware of that situational element, and the world is aware of that element as well. So then it's been talked about more, and Lando's having to deal with it. And I don't mean this in a critical way. He is sensitive to that stuff. He talks about that openly, but it's more just, you know, Norris is still having a perfectly decent season on paper, and as Mark said, he's in a position where Norris can turn this around. I think Norris is the slightly faster McLaren driver. That evidence is borne out across practice and qualifying so far this year. If Lando pulls it together and is at his brilliant best more often than not, he can and probably will win the world championship. But he isn't at that level often enough. Piastri is at his best more often than Norris is at his own best. And Piastri's best has got better than last year. You know, the big deficits aren't there in the way that they were before. The sort of 2-3 margins have disappeared. He's a tenth and a half off at most now. But he's also as quick or slightly quicker than Norris more often than he was before, and he still has that little bit of an edge on Sundays in terms of the way that he drives. And the best example of that is Miami, because when Andrea Stella was defending Norris after Miami, he pointed out that it took Piastri and Norris the same number of laps to get past Verstappen. So his argument was therefore that Norris hadn't dithered or anything like that. That was a little bit generous, I think, because you can lose a whole lot of time in the same number of laps trying to get past people. The way that Piastri got past Verstappen was effectively sized him up, tried one move into turn one that didn't work, then nailed him the second time. Norris took at least one or two more attempts physically to go past, but also the way that he tried to get past, they were less efficient. They cost him more time because he ran out of road. He had to back out of it, whatever. So that's an edge that Piastri still has. So he's basically proving a much more formidable internal and championship rival to Norris than I think anyone, including Norris, would have expected for 2025. I think the step that he's made for this year, I was expecting something. I've long been an advocate of Piastri's and felt that his potential is incredibly high, but we spent basically all of pre-season answering every question about Piastri in a championship sense with, well, it depends on how much he improves in qualifying and if he can improve in time management and if those races where he goes missing aren't there anymore. He's ticked every box pretty much. Yes, he's not still quite that final 0.1% versus Norris at their absolute best. Maybe he's not quite there yet. Maybe it won't ever be. Who knows? But I think the level that he's performing at now is higher than I thought it would be in 25.
There are two things, Mark, that's really impressed me about Piastri this year. One, the fact that he managed to win in China and Spain, which were two really weak tracks for him last year. So that's kind of a very, very good signal of the step he's made. And also, while there have been weekends where he's just been the class of the field, if you like, he's also won on weekends when he's not been the quicker driver. And again, that's not a negative because you only rack up big numbers. He's won 5 out of 10 Grand Prix this year. You only rack up those numbers and championships if you can win when not at your absolute best. So those are two very positive trends I think we've seen from him.
Yeah, and that ability to hold the big picture in your head while struggling competitively is very much a trait of several championship winners in the past. So yeah, he tends to win when he's quicker, and he sometimes wins when he's not quicker. So that's formidable.
Right, we're now going to address some questions from the Race Members Club on Norris versus Piastri, and we had a lot of these after the Canadian Grand Prix. If you're interested in the Race Members Club, head to patreon.com and search for the race, or click the link in the episode description. You can find out a little bit more about the Members Club and what it offers, bonus exclusive podcasts. You get an ad-free listening, you get advanced access to various videos and the like, loads and loads of extra content that we really enjoy doing. But Mark, first up, a question from Jack Goodall. Yes, it's early, but come on, let's be honest. We're watching Lando fumble the title here, aren't we?
No, we've watched him fumble the first bit of the job, but there's still an awful lot of the job left to complete. And I think it's very easy to predict based by extrapolating what's already happened. So it's easy to predict the past, in other words. But that's not always. History shows that just extrapolating what's happened in the past isn't naturally an automatic indicator of what will happen in the future. So yeah, we might be getting to the end of the year and that might hold up. But to have called it at this stage, I think you'd be, I've used the phrase before, you'd be right in calling the outcome, but for the wrong reasons, for the wrong reasoning. And so I think all the problems that Norris has faced, which we've just been discussing, are absolutely valid. But there's nothing to say that he doesn't tune into the car in a way that makes his peaks more accessible, and just does it through steamrollering performance superiority. That's not an impossible thing to happen. We've seen enough traits there to realize that there's the potential there within him to do that. But that's not to say that is what will happen. But it's I think it's way, way too early to call, just because we've seen these patterns, that these patterns will definitely continue, and that's what we're going to see. So no, I disagree with the question.
And that's the critical thing about, when we started looking into this, that's why when we did our YouTube video on it, and it was framed as, why Norris is blowing the title. It's because up to this point he is, but the reason for that is because you can't blow something that you're not in control of or have the chance to win. And the reason Norris has the chance to win and is therefore has been blowing it to this point is because he's so fast. Because when he is at his best, he can be better than Piastri. He can win this world championship. This championship is there for him to win, and he may yet win it. He can turn it around. If he addresses half of what we've been talking about so far, that might be enough to start swinging it properly in his favor. So yes, I think up to this point, Norris hasn't been at a level good enough to win this year's world championship, and that is borne out by the fact that he's nearly a race win's worth of points behind Piastri now after 10 races, and Piastri's won more races than him, had more poles than him, has more points than him. But that doesn't mean that's how the next 14 weekends are going to go. It frames the way that obviously we're talking about it now, And it means that if Norris turns this around, I think it will be that more an impressive achievement. And he would be rightly lauded for that if he does take more control of it.
Next up, a question for you, Scott, from Peter Gillam. Is the McLaren mental battle fought and won now by Piastri?
No, it's not won, again, for the same reasons as Mark was explaining about the other trends that we've seen. Is just because he has been winning it up until this point doesn't mean that he's got it won. And I think that'll be answered by whether the trends that have started to emerge become defining traits, which again taps into something I think Mark said earlier. We've seen things that have defined how certain weekends have played out, certain sessions have gone, certain incidents, but that doesn't make them completely character defining. And it would be premature to say that, because yes, it can be quite convenient, and we've done it on this podcast, made comparisons to stuff Norris has done in the past, but it is too convenient to say in the first 10 races of his first proper F1 title fight, oh, this proves everything that was seen 18 months ago was absolutely correct. Let's see how he reacts now, because for all of the pressure and everything that Norris has been under for the first 10 races, that's nothing compared to the fact that he's got 14 race weekends now to save his championship bid. And at the same time, Piastri, nicely controlled. He's done very, very well. But he also went into this season not as the favourite McLaren driver to win the championship. I think Piastri is incredibly mentally robust, and I think he is very, very strong. But he's also inexperienced still. He's a young F1 driver, and he's not immune to mistakes. Remember Hungary last year when he ran off the road? That could have been incredibly costly. That's what let Norris come back at him and created the situation that caused that whole team orders saga in Budapest last season. Piastri is now going to be the one, especially if Norris gets it together, who's under massive pressure. It's going to be his championship to lose. So it might swing back towards Norris in the second half of the season. If Piastri goes on a run of weekends where he underperforms, makes some mistakes, isn't quite there in qualifying, missteps in races, whatever, then it will change. And the commentary around it, the narrative around it, will change accordingly. It's still too soon to be that definitive about who has won the mental battle as much as the championship fight.
Next question from Amoros Rokaj that I'll take. Will Norris be able to truly go wheel to wheel with Piastri this season and pass on bravery and racecraft? And David Sally asks if Lando Norris has an impatience with his racecraft. I certainly don't think bravery is an issue. There's no problem with that. But yes, I think patience and racecraft generally, Piastri has an advantage, because Norris, on that bravery point, he tends to, if there's an opening and a chance, he tends to go there. Think of Bahrain on the last lap with Russell, where really he wanted to defer that attack to the second DRS zone.
Just wait 10 seconds, Lando. I remember watching that at home and just thinking, oh, the move's on. It's right there. People have been doing it all right. Like Leclerc's won races in Bahrain before, hasn't he? By making that move, just delaying it, being smart. And I just remember thinking, oh, why are you doing this? But you're absolutely right. The gap opens up and he feels he has to take it. He's been watching that Senna interview too much. That's the problem.
Russell absolutely suckered him in on that one. But yeah, I think Norris does need to show better judgment. Obviously, Canada is the ultimate indicator of that. So you definitely say that currently Piastri has a racecraft advantage and he's just a little bit more calm and calculating. So that's an area where, yeah, he has the edge and Norris needs to make some steps. Mark, a question from Stefano Mod. Is Lando Norris the most honest person in F1 right now? That's not a very hotly contested battle normally in F1, is it?
No, not really. He's certainly very open and maybe to his own detriment. Sometimes that's very much one of his characteristics, isn't it? And that's just who he is. And that's how he deals with the various pressures placed upon him. Yeah, I mean, he is very open and honest about his own performances. But there is also an underlying conviction about he knows exactly how quick he is. You do hear it sometimes in the little sub-clauses he makes. He's just like, yeah, I messed up there because, and the underlying message is always, I was quicker than him and I would have beaten them if I hadn't let myself down. So there is an underlying conviction. So I wouldn't call it a lack of confidence, but in expressing himself honestly, you also hear not just acknowledgement of the weaknesses, but also he's totally convinced about how good he is.
Right, Scott, a question for you from Zephyr. Is Norris de facto the second driver for McLaren, at least until the end of the season?
No. I think McLaren has proven too many times that it has no interest in labels, either explicit or de facto or whatever. There was a gulf between the two drivers in terms of their peaks and points and championship prospects last season, to be honest, and they still clung on as long as possible to avoid interfering in any way. And I don't think that so that's just from a team perspective, and then just in terms of dynamics, which I think is more what the question is hinting at. I'm not sure that's the case either, because as I've been saying sort of consistently through this podcast, Norris is still the faster driver. He's still got a tiny, and it's hundredths of a second probably, but he has got an edge of pace that just will constantly give him what, and Mark alluded to it just now. It'll give him that little bit of confidence every single time. It'll be something that he can take some comfort in. That'll be the silver lining from the start of the season and where we've got to at this point, that he knows that the pace is in him, that he if he hooks it up, and that is obviously the big question, then he will more often than not beat his teammate. So I don't think that Piastri can have that kind of superiority in team dynamics or internal dynamics or their own rivalry, the way that Norris, like I don't think Norris is going to shrink against Piastri necessarily. But at the same time, I would say that Piastri doesn't need de facto or actual number one status. We saw last year when he was basically de facto number two briefly, that he was still perfectly happy racing his teammate when the situation allowed.
Next up, a question from Oyeyemi Taiwo. Can you envision a scenario of Norris leaving McLaren at the end of the year if Piastri wins the title, and if so, where to? Aston Martin? It feels as though the pressure is getting to him. He's more prone to mistakes that could ultimately cost him a title this year. I'm not sure he'd accept being a number two driver should that happen later on this season. I think it's unlikely that there'll be a McLaren driver leaving at the end of the year, not just because they're under contract, but I think it would require some kind of spectacular blow-up in the team for that to happen. However, history does tell us that the team will kind of end up leaning one way or the other, not explicitly, but one driver will generally assert themselves, and whoever wins this title could well have taken a giant stride towards making McLaren their team, and that could lead to the other driver wanting to move on. And you would have to say that based on the current trends, and there are dangers in extrapolating the trends, but based on what we've seen so far this season, it is Piastri's on the trajectory to do that, and therefore Norris, he might be on the trajectory to want to move on. But they both stress the desire and the ambition to be at McLaren long term. That's why they've got those long term deals, and for it not to fall apart. So it's not a foregone conclusion, but I think both of those drivers, if they feel that they've kind of been beaten to number two status, and that's just where they're locked based on performance, not on the team doing it, it'll be performance that causes it, then they will want to move on. But I think we're quite a long way off any possibility of something happening at the end of the year. That would require quite a lot to happen. But there's, as we've said, 14 race weekends. Who knows what might happen in those. Right, Mark, a question from Nir Yogev. Is it now safe to say that Norris makes too many mistakes, both in qualifying and in races, to become a world champion? Now, from your previous answers, we know it's not safe to say that yet. But I just want to just slightly add to this question. If it keeps going this way, then it's going to stop him being world champion, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the important distinction. So now I think it's far too early to say that it will prevent him being world champion, but that's not to say that what's happened in the past will happen in the future. So no, it's I think he's perfectly capable of winning the world championship. He's not the current favourite to do so, but it's well within his grasp still.
Exactly. Yeah, it's all about him trying to kind of fix those loose ends and make the change, because on current trajectory, absolutely, Piastri will win the championship. But yeah, past performance doesn't necessarily predict future trends, does it?
Well, it's worth just pointing out there that Norris could lead the championship into the summer break just by winning every single race. So it might genuinely change by the time that everybody goes off on their holidays in August. That's how close it is. That's how much it is within Norris's grasp. You know, Piastri could follow Norris home in all four of those races and lose the championship lead. So yeah, it's not like he's shipped 50 points to Piastri and been a no-hoper. And that's, I think, just in case that hasn't come across so far in everything we've said, is very important to ram home.
Yeah, I think that there'll be some listening who are thinking, oh, you're just defending Norris and saying why you can do it, and being harsh on Piastri or vice versa. But we're trying to kind of express the state of play where it is now, and there's no question that it's going Piastri's way currently, and it may continue to go his way, but it's still not decided, and that's what makes it an interesting one. Scott, the final question in this section comes from Dara Payton. Lando Norris's message after the incident in Canada was very calm. To me, I think he knows this championship is gone and is becoming accepting of it.
No, I don't think it was that. I think it was more that it's a bit of a combination of, I think, was Mark's answer before about the honesty that Norris exhibits, but also I think it does actually speak a little bit to the McLaren culture, the fact that this is something that had been talked about in advance, that they knew that they would either come to blows wheel to wheel, or that a driver might make a simple mistake and be at fault. And then when that happened, it was up to the driver that was in the wrong to take responsibility. And this was something that was immediately obvious. It was Norris's fault. It wasn't that he got a wheel alongside and Piastri put him into the wall or anything like that. It was 100% on Norris, and Norris knew that immediately. So partly because it's who he is, and partly because it was the right thing to do for the team to apologise to them, and partly because taking responsibility for something like that is something that had to be done within those dynamics at McLaren, and what had been discussed just meant that that was the right thing to do in that scenario. I think it's as simple as that. I think that was more just a reflection of him as a person and that situation as a team. I think it would be a little bit more telling if it was I put it this way, that wasn't Lando throwing it into the wall at Monza and then taking his steering wheel off and having a big emotional strop at the side of the track or something like that. That wasn't his, he knows he's thrown this away moment.
Yeah, I think it's probably a positive that he was also able to, as soon as the incident happened, he saw what had happened, understood it, didn't try and rationalise it. A lot of drivers would have found a way to try and blame the other driver. So actually, I think that's just a positive. What he accepted there is he got it spectacularly wrong. But at least that means he started the process of trying to put that in the past and move on behind him immediately. Right, in the final part of the podcast, Mark, we're going to look ahead to the Austrian Grand Prix. Are McLaren favourites in your mind? And if so, who's the closest challenger?
Yes, I think the other favourites. I think they're the favourites generally, as we're going to any weekend. And sometimes somebody can come from behind and surprise them like Mercedes did in Canada. But Austria should be particularly good for them. Long corners, quite quick. It doesn't really expose any of their less strong characteristics and rewards the really good ones. So yes, there will be very good there, I feel. But that's not to say that the others don't have a chance. I think I'd be looking particularly at Red Bull for this one.
And we've got to remember, of course, Max Verstappen. We haven't talked about him in the championship fight, but he's still sort of hanging in there. It's quite a big gap now, but he cannot be discounted, and he could become a factor in that.
And let him hear you say that, Ed.
Yeah, well, he's been firmly denying that. I can't necessarily blame him because it's been a real struggle. It's only really the fact Verstappen pretty consistently drags everything out of that car that's kept him there. But we can't rule out the possibility of another step forward from Red Bull. But you'd have to say, Scott, the Red Bull Ring's probably quite a nice circuit for Norris to go to if he wants to get back on an even keel, because though he's never won there in a Grand Prix, he has had some success there in the past. It's quite a nice track for him, but at the same time, there's a few corners where his struggles with the traits of the car might rear their head quite emphatically as well. So I guess he has to look at the positives of that, the fact this is a good track for him historically. Yeah,
it's actually, from that perspective, it's really interesting because it will show us a little bit more about how at one with this McLaren he feels. It's another chance, and Mark talked about this before, but it's another chance to get more data on that front suspension tweak, because it is only it's a sample set of the Canadian Grand Prix, and that track's very specific. You could obviously argue that about every single circuit, but Montreal is just, there's so much about sort of your own sort of personal flow and feeling around that circuit. Austria, I think the precision that's required under braking in the first corner, the way that you want to chuck it in, it's just so different. You're trying to get every millimeter absolutely right through turn one, but then you go up, you've got the long climb up the hill, heavy braking that can absolutely make or break your lap. It's such a deceptive track. It's one of the reasons why it's one of my favorites on the calendar. It's so hard. I don't think there's an easy corner on the circuit. Maybe in these cars, the only corner that's relatively straightforward is the left-right in the middle of the lap, which is about as conventional high speed, medium speed S's as you can get. but pretty much every single corner either rises, falls away, has a blind part to it, has a real horrible curb on entry or exit. Wonderful circuit, and I think it will tell us a lot about where Norris is at. But he does have a great, even though obviously that result went missing last year in particular, he's got a really good track record there of putting in some real eye-catching performances.
I have to say, Mark, it's a good point what Scott says about this track, isn't it? It's only just over 60 seconds, but it's one that really invites errors, doesn't it? The gaps are always really small, partly because it's such a short lap in terms of time, so proportionally the gaps will be smaller, but it's a track that sometimes people talk about as, oh, it's not like the old Österreich that it's in the shadow of, and obviously it's the same track but reduced in many ways. But I think it's a brilliant modern F1 track, and it's always one of the highlights of the year because of that.
Yeah, it's intense. There's very little resting time in between, the attack of the corners, and also it combines that with it being a good racing venue. There's always passing opportunities. There's turns 3 and 4 is like one long combined opportunity. And there's various ways of pulling off an overtake in those corners. So yes, it's I think one of the best venues on the calendar, and probably I think in terms of beauty, just aesthetics, I think it's number one. I don't know if you want to challenge me on that. I'm trying to think of
something about it. It's a proper track, isn't it? When you watch it, there's something about the combination of the circuit, the color of the curbs, the nature of the curbs, the grass, the gravel, the grandstands. Like the track itself is really aesthetically pleasing. It's what you would draw as a kid, I reckon. Just the track itself, and then obviously pan big picture, and you see the whole surroundings as well. Like it's I'm struggling off the top of my head to think of something that would knock that off, just in terms of pure beauty of circuit and surroundings.
Maybe Spa in its sort of icy coldness, but
it's just that constant
sort of
haze of light grey.
yeah, but it is beautiful. But I'd be tending towards Red Bull Ring for aesthetics.
What's great about that track is, unlike Spa, it's all like laid out in front of you, isn't it? So, for example, where the media centre is in the kind of main grandstand, so it's opposite the paddock, so you have to go down and through the tunnel to get in. But you can see the whole track, and you can see the sort of the wider countryside. Obviously, it's a very hilly circuit, so I don't know how well it comes over on the television. I never think you really completely get a track until you've actually been there, and obviously we're very fortunate to have been to a great many racing circuits to get that. But yeah, it's an unusual one in terms of the fact that you can just see it all laid out in front of you, which on top of just the fact that it's just a beautiful area, just makes for a great venue.
Well, I think one of the things that does lend itself to like being a good TV spectacle as well is first of all, like it just looks impressive even on television compared to reality. But the point that Mark made when he talked about being intense and an intense lap, I think that comes across on the broadcast too, because they come around very quickly, and obviously that's a massive benefit when you're there watching trackside in the grandstands, for example. I know this is a track, for example, that my dad has travelled to by coach several times in recent years, and he's gutted that he's not going there this year. He and his friends went to Imola this year instead, and loved that. That was their first experience of Imola with the Tifosi. They'd done Monza, but they said like Imola was amazing. But he's gutted not to be going back. But when you watch it on TV, I think it's one where the laps can rattle away really quickly because of how short it is. So even though it's a long race in terms of lap count, you can cycle through that quite fast. And so I think that gives the race quite a nice cadence. It feels like you're working through the race quite sharply. I think that at the same time can have the potential, if it's a bit of a nothing race, the middle can just be a little bit like you're just slowly ticking through them and you're just getting to the end. But I do think it works from a TV point of view as well. It's also good for racing, which helps. That just means that whether you're watching trackside or on television, it's a fun race to tune into.
Yeah, it certainly ticks all the boxes. Mark, just to come back to looking ahead to the weekends, how do you feel Mercedes might fare, and could we see anything from Ferrari? Ferrari have talked a little bit about having some upgrades. I don't know for certain exactly what they'll have here and whether It could be the rear suspension modifications that they've been expecting, probably the internals primarily rather than visual stuff. But could you see either of them being a factor? Mercedes, particularly with the fact that it's historically quite a hot race, this one.
Yeah, I think they're both dark horses, actually. On previous form, you would say the long corners and high track temperatures will not be ideal for Mercedes, but they had a very hot track in Canada. They reintroduced the new rear suspension there, and they had fantastic control of the tyre temperatures and the tyre graining, which was the issue for everyone there. So maybe that's in the past, that previous trait. Let's see. And the other one, if Ferrari really is bringing their the new rear end, which will allow them to run the car lower without wearing away the plank excessively, then we're potentially back to the Ferrari we saw up to China, which was a very quick car. So yeah, they're a couple of dark horses. I wouldn't write them off at this stage.
I've just been checking the weather forecast for the weekend, and it's for pretty high temperatures. Not the highest I've ever seen for that race, but it does look like it's going to be a fairly hot one this weekend. So that's always a factor. But it's going to be a really interesting weekend because it just always is. Plus, all the stuff we talked about with the World Championship dynamic is going to make it an important one. Of course, it's a sprint weekend again this year, isn't it? Austria normally is, so that'll add a little bit of extra. I don't know what it'll add, a little bit of extra. It'll add an extra race, let's put it that way. Yeah, so there's more points on offer.
It'll add an extra degree of confusion amongst all of us, I'm sure, because you saying that is the first time that it's been on my radar, to be honest. And there'll definitely be a point through the weekend where I think all three of us, there's no shame in admitting this, will be slightly confused about what session's coming next and what time it's coming.
Yeah, sprint races always surprise me. They, I tend to.
You get the best thing about your confusion with the sprint is when you're slightly confused that like the race isn't happening at a time it's definitely not meant to be happening.
I'm just actually double checking. Is it actually a sprint? I should know this.
We should all know this.
Said it was.
Yeah. Well, I did say it was, didn't I? Because it always is in Austria, isn't it?
It's usually a good venue for it.
We've had one for the past few years, but it's one of the it's not, is it? There we go. Yeah, it's not.
What are the sprints?
The sprints are
China and Miami, obviously.
We've had those. Belgium, Austin, Brazil, as it always is, and Qatar. So I've completely lied there. That tells you how weird the whole sprint thing is, doesn't it? That I just suddenly thought of it. Oh, yeah, there's going to be a sprint, and then no, it's absolutely not. I don't know.
Well, we've already talked about what happened in the past. You can't just extrapolate that in the future. Ed.
That's very very true.
You're just fallen for the oldest trick in the book.
Excellent.
Well, they're giving people a bit of entertainment because they'll have been listening to me thinking, what are you talking about?
Just a good opportunity for us, even when it's not a sprint weekend, for you to get on your sprint weekend soapbox. So
exactly. I mean, I prefer the sprints as they are now. They have got a bit better and they have got a little bit more logical. So it's better than when it was that horrible disconnect in the middle of the weekend. But anyway, we shouldn't be talking about sprint races because the next one's at Spa. That, of course, is before the summer break. So I'm sure that one will be taking me by surprise next month. So anyway, most of the chat in this podcast has been excellent, apart from me going completely mad at the end there and not knowing what was going on, but that will happen sometimes. So thanks very much to Mark and Scott, who will be heading off to Austria imminently. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of F1.